That night never felt important when it started. It was just another family visit, another crowded house, another evening filled with noise that slowly faded into silence. But something about the way they looked at me that day stayed in my head longer than it should have. I remember brushing it off, telling myself I was overthinking, that it was just familiarity, just family being close. I wish I had trusted that feeling instead of ignoring it. I've always been the quiet one. The kind of person who stays in the background, listens more than speaks, avoids attention. Growing up, I never questioned the boundaries around me because they were always clear. Family meant safety. It meant trust without hesitation. And my cousins were part of that trust. We grew up together, shared childhood memories, laughed over the same old stories, teased each other like siblings do. Nothing about them ever felt unfamiliar. Until that night. They were different from each other in ways that balanced everything out. One of them had this calm presence, soft voice, the kind of person who could make you feel understood without saying much. The other was the opposite, louder, more playful, always pushing limits just a little further than everyone else. I never thought much about that contrast before. It just felt normal. But that evening, I started noticing small things I had never paid attention to before. It began with simple moments. A joke that lasted a second too long. A glance that didn't break when it should have. Sitting closer than usual, close enough for me to notice, but not close enough to question out loud. I told myself it didn't mean anything. People act differently during family gatherings. Everyone gets more relaxed, more open. That's what I kept repeating in my head. The house was full, more than usual. Relatives had come from different places, and rooms filled up quickly. By the time it got late, there wasn't much space left. It was decided casually, like it didn't matter, that they would sleep in my room. No one thought twice about it. I didn't either, at least not in a way I admitted to myself. It felt normal on the surface. It should have been normal. We stayed up longer than everyone else. The kind of late-night conversation that starts with random topics and slowly turns personal without you realizing when it changed. At first, it was harmless. Memories, jokes, things we used to laugh about as kids. Then it shifted. Questions became deeper. Not inappropriate, just different. They asked me things no one had asked before. About how I felt, about being alone sometimes, about whether I ever felt like no one really understood me. I didn't expect myself to answer the way I did. I'm not someone who opens up easily, but something about that moment made it feel easy. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the way they listened. Or maybe it was something else I didn't want to name. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't invisible. Like someone was actually paying attention. One of them leaned slightly closer while I was talking, nodding slowly, holding eye contact in a way that made it hard to look away. The other added comments here and there, light at first, then more direct, almost like they were guiding the conversation somewhere specific. I noticed it, but I didn't stop it. I didn't even question it properly. I just let it happen. At some point, the lights were turned off. No one announced it. It just happened naturally, like the conversation didn't need light anymore. The room fell into darkness, but the silence didn't come. We kept talking, voices softer now, slower. The kind of tone people use when they don't want to be heard, even when there's no real reason to hide. That's when the feeling changed completely. It wasn't anything obvious at first. Just the awareness that someone was closer than before. A shift in position. The sound of movement that didn't match the casual tone of the conversation. My mind caught it immediately, but I stayed still. I didn't react. I told myself it was nothing, just adjusting to get comfortable. But then there was a pause. A silence that felt heavier than any words we had exchanged. And in that silence, I realized I was paying attention to every small detail. Breathing. Distance. The space between us that didn't feel the same anymore. One of them whispered something, low enough that it felt closer than it sounded. I couldn't even fully process the words, just the tone. It wasn't the same tone from earlier. It carried something else. Something I couldn't explain but couldn't ignore either. My heart started beating faster, not out of fear exactly, but out of confusion. I didn't understand why I suddenly felt so aware of everything. Why I was noticing things I had never noticed before. Why the room, which had always felt safe, now felt different. I should have said something. I should have created distance, turned on the light, ended the conversation. But I didn't. I stayed quiet, frozen between knowing something was off and convincing myself it wasn't serious enough to react. Another small movement. Closer this time. Close enough that there was no pretending it was accidental. And that's when it hit me. Something was wrong. Not in a loud, obvious way. Not in a way that demanded immediate action. But in a quiet, undeniable way that settled deep inside me. The kind of wrong that doesn't shout, but lingers. The kind that makes you question your own judgment before anything even happens. I lay there, completely still, staring into the darkness even though I couldn't see anything. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of a situation I didn't want to fully understand. Every instinct told me to stop this before it became something else. But another part of me, a part one didn't recognize, kept me silent. And in that silence, as the distance between us disappeared inch by inch, I realized that whatever this was, it had already gone too far to pretend it was nothing. I didn't move. That was the first mistake. I told myself I was just trying to understand what was happening, but deep down I knew I was allowing it to continue. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything we had said before. No one laughed anymore. No one tried to lighten the mood. It was like all three of us were aware of the shift, but no one wanted to be the one to acknowledge it first. Then one of them spoke again, softly, asking if I was still awake. The question sounded simple, but it carried something underneath it, something intentional. I answered without thinking. My voice came out lower than usual, almost cautious. That small exchange changed everything. It confirmed that we were all present in that moment, fully aware, no excuses left. The conversation didn't return to what it was before. It moved forward into something more personal, more direct. They started asking questions that felt closer, questions about relationships, about whether I had ever felt connected to someone, whether I ever felt like I was missing something. It wasn't teasing anymore. It felt like they were trying to open something inside me. I hesitated at first, but they didn't rush me. That was the part that made it harder to resist. They gave me space, let the silence stretch just enough that I felt the need to fill it. And when I did, I found myself saying things I had never said out loud before. About feeling unnoticed, about not really knowing what it's like to be understood. I don't know why I said those things. Maybe because it felt safe in that darkness, like I couldn't be judged if no one could see me. One of them responded quietly, almost reassuring, saying they understood exactly what I meant. The way they said it made it feel real, like they had been waiting for me to admit it. The other added something lighter, but still close, almost like they were balancing each other, keeping me from pulling away. I became aware of how close they were again. Not just physically, but in the way they spoke, in the way they focused on me. It didn't feel like a group conversation anymore. It felt like everything was centered around me, like I was being pulled into something I didn't fully control. I told myself this was wrong. I repeated it in my head, over and over. But every time I thought about stopping it, something held me back. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the feeling of being seen in a way I had never experienced before. Or maybe it was the way they made everything feel normal, like nothing unusual was happening. Then came the moment where it couldn't be ignored anymore. A small, deliberate movement. Not accidental this time. Something that made it clear this wasn't just in my head. My body reacted instantly, tensing without me meaning to. I froze again, caught between pulling away and staying still. My mind was loud, telling me to stop this, to say something, to create distance. But my voice didn't follow. One of them noticed. I could tell by the way their tone changed slightly, softer, almost reassuring, like they were trying to calm me without addressing it directly. They said something simple, something that could be taken as harmless, but in that moment it felt like permission. Not forced, not demanded, just offered. The other didn't say much, but their presence felt stronger, closer. It was like they didn't need words to influence what was happening. The contrast between them became clearer now. One was guiding emotionally, making me feel understood, lowering my resistance. The other was pushing the boundary without explaining it, making it harder for me to pretend this was still normal. I felt trapped in between them. Not physically, but mentally. Every thought I had was split. One part of me was screaming that this was crossing a line that shouldn't even be approached. The other part was quiet, almost curious, trying to understand why I wasn't stopping it. The questions continued, but now they were different. Less about general feelings, more about me specifically. What I wanted, what I felt, what I thought about certain things I had never considered before. It felt like they were slowly removing every excuse I had to deny what was happening. I realized something in that moment that made it even harder to react. They were completely comfortable. There was no hesitation in them, no confusion. Whatever this was, they had already accepted it before I did. That realization made me feel even more uncertain. If they weren't questioning it, why was I the only one struggling? That thought shouldn't have made sense, but it did in that moment. I tried to shift slightly, to create space, but it didn't last. The closeness returned almost immediately, like the distance I created didn't matter. My breathing changed, slower but heavier, and I became aware of how tense my body was. I wasn't relaxed, not even close, but I wasn't pulling away either. Another pause. Another silence that felt intentional. Then one of them said something that stayed with me. They told me I think too much. It wasn't said as criticism. It sounded almost gentle, like they were trying to ease my mind. But it had the opposite effect. It made me question myself even more. Was I overthinking this? Was I turning something harmless into something bigger than it was? That doubt started to weaken the part of me that wanted to stop everything. I hated that feeling. The uncertainty. The way my own thoughts were turning against me. And that's when I realized I was losing control of the situation. Not because they forced anything. Not because something dramatic happened. But because I stopped trusting my own judgment. I stopped acting on what I knew was right, and started following what felt easier in the moment. The line was already blurred. And instead of stepping back, I was standing right on it, letting it disappear completely. I didn't say no. I didn't say anything at all. And that silence became my answer. Once that silence settled in, everything moved without needing to be explained. There was no clear moment where it started, no single action that could be pointed at and labeled as the turning point. It just happened in fragments, small decisions not made, boundaries not enforced, seconds stretching into something irreversible. I was aware the entire time, and that made it worse. I couldn't pretend I didn't understand what was happening anymore. My thoughts were loud, almost overwhelming, but my body didn't follow them. Every instinct told me to stop, to pull away, to say something that would break whatever this was becoming. But the more I delayed, the harder it felt to interrupt it. It was like I had already crossed a line in my mind, and now I was stuck trying to justify standing there instead of stepping back. One of them stayed close in a way that felt steady, controlled, almost calculated. The other moved with more confidence, less hesitation, like they had no doubt about where this was going. That difference between them kept pulling me in two directions at once. One made it feel emotionally acceptable, like I wasn't doing something completely wrong. The other made it impossible to ignore that this was far beyond anything normal. I kept thinking, just one word and this ends. Just one reaction and everything goes back to how it should be. But I didn't say that word. I didn't create that distance. And with every second that passed, the situation became something I couldn't undo. There was a moment where everything slowed down. Not physically, but in my mind. I became aware of every detail at once, the closeness, the silence, the weight of what was happening. It felt unreal, like I was watching it instead of being part of it. I remember thinking this doesn't feel like me. This isn't who I am. But that thought didn't stop anything. It just made me feel disconnected from myself. The tension built to a point where it couldn't stay unspoken anymore. Not in words, but in presence. There was no pretending left. Whatever this was, it had fully crossed into something undeniable. And I let it happen. That realization hit me harder than anything else. Not what they were doing, not the situation itself, but the fact that I wasn't stopping it. Time became unclear after that. It didn't feel like minutes or hours. It felt like one long moment stretched too far. My mind kept jumping between guilt and confusion, between wanting it to end and not knowing how to end it without making everything worse. That contradiction kept me frozen. Eventually, everything slowed down again, but this time it wasn't building up to anything. It was fading. The intensity dropped, the silence returned, heavier than before. No one spoke immediately. There was nothing to say that could make sense of what had just happened. I stayed completely still, staring into the darkness even though it felt different now. The room didn't feel the same. It didn't feel safe, didn't feel familiar. It felt like something had shifted permanently, something I couldn't put back. One of them adjusted slightly, creating a small distance, like nothing unusual had happened. The other stayed quiet, but their presence felt distant now, not physically, but emotionally. That change was subtle, but I noticed it instantly. The connection that had been there just moments ago felt weaker, almost gone. I wanted someone to say something. Anything. To explain it, to acknowledge it, to make it make sense. But no one did. And that silence made everything feel heavier. My mind started racing again, but now it wasn't confusion. It was realization. I started replaying everything, every moment leading up to this, every decision I didn't make. I saw it clearly now. The way the conversation was guided, the way my responses were encouraged, the way my hesitation was softened until it disappeared. I felt something I hadn't felt before in that situation. Regret. Not just for what happened, but for how easily I allowed it to happen. For how I ignored my own instincts, how I let myself be pulled into something I knew was wrong from the beginning. That realization sat heavy in my chest, making it hard to even breathe normally. After a while, one of them spoke, but their tone had changed. It was lighter, almost casual, like they were trying to move past it without addressing it. They said something small, something unrelated, as if shifting the conversation back to normal would erase what just happened. The other responded briefly, matching that tone, not adding anything more. That was the moment it hit me the hardest. To them, this wasn't what it felt like to me. There was no weight in their voices, no hesitation, no sign that they were struggling with what had just happened. It felt normal to them. Temporary, maybe, but not significant. That difference in perception made everything inside me sink. I realized I had attached meaning to something they hadn't. I had let myself believe that the emotional connection, the way they spoke to me, the way they made me feel seen, meant something deeper. But now, in the quiet aftermath, it felt one-sided. Like I had been pulled into something that ended the moment it reached its peak. The rest of the night passed without anything else happening. No more tension, no more closeness. Just silence and distance that felt colder than before. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed everything again, but clearer, harsher, without the confusion that had clouded it before. By the time the first signs of morning came, I felt completely drained. Not physically, but mentally. Like something inside me had been taken apart and left unresolved. When we finally got up, nothing was said about the night. No acknowledgement, no awkward conversation, nothing. One of them acted completely normal, like it was just another day. The other was quieter, avoiding direct eye contact, but not in a way that suggested guilt. More like indifference. I tried to match their behavior, but it didn't feel natural. Every movement felt forced, every word felt like I was pretending. The normality of everything around me made it worse. It felt like I was the only one carrying the weight of what had happened. And then I noticed something that made everything even clearer. A small exchange between them. A look, a subtle one, but enough for me to understand. This wasn't new to them. That realization hit harder than anything else that night. Not because of what happened, but because of what it meant. I wasn't special in that moment. I was just part of something I didn't fully understand until it was already over. The days after felt heavier than the night itself. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface, But everything inside me had shifted in a way I couldn't ignore. I tried to act normal, to move through routines like nothing had changed, but even the smallest interactions felt different now. Every time I saw them, I became aware of something I hadn't felt before, distance mixed with something unresolved. They didn't bring it up. Not once. No messages, no private conversations, no attempt to explain or even acknowledge it. At first, I thought maybe they were waiting, maybe they expected me to say something. But as time passed, it became clear they had already moved on. Whatever that night meant, it didn't stay with them the way it stayed with me. I kept replaying it, not the details, but the feeling. The way I let it happen. The way I ignored every warning sign my mind gave me. That part bothered me more than anything else. I wasn't forced into it. I wasn't unaware. I knew something was wrong, and I chose silence. That realization didn't leave me. Family gatherings became uncomfortable in a quiet, controlled way. No one else noticed anything, but I did. Every glance felt loaded, even when it wasn't. Every laugh sounded normal, but I questioned it anyway. I started avoiding being alone in the same space with them, not out of fear, but because I didn't trust how I would feel. One of them continued acting exactly the same as before. Casual, playful, like nothing had changed. That made it harder to process, because it erased any sense of significance I had attached to that night. The other remained distant, not cold, but not the same either. There was no effort to reconnect, no sign that they cared about what it had done to me mentally. That contrast slowly gave me clarity. What I thought was connection wasn't mutual. What I thought was something meaningful was just a moment for them. Temporary, situational, something that didn't carry weight once it ended. I had mistaken attention for understanding. I had confused closeness with something deeper than it actually was. The guilt didn't disappear, but it changed form. At first, it was about what happened. Then it became about why I allowed it. I started questioning myself more than them. Why didn't I stop it? Why did I let their words influence me so easily? Why did I ignore my own boundaries just because I felt seen for a moment? Those questions didn't have simple answers, but they forced me to look at something I had avoided before. I wasn't just a victim of the situation. I was part of it. Not equally responsible for everything, but responsible for not protecting myself when I had the chance. Time passed, but the memory didn't fade the way I expected. It stayed clear, not because of what happened physically, but because of what it revealed. It showed me how easily trust can be misplaced. How quickly comfort can turn into something else when boundaries aren't respected. And how dangerous it is to ignore your instincts just because something feels good in the moment. There was a point where I considered confronting them. Not out of anger, but for closure. I thought maybe hearing something from them would make it easier to move on. But every time I imagined that conversation, it felt pointless. I already knew the answer. Their actions had made it clear. It didn't mean what I thought it meant. So I let it go, not in a way that erased it, but in a way that stopped me from expecting anything from them. I stopped looking for acknowledgement. I stopped hoping they would understand what it did to me. That shift didn't happen instantly, but once it did, everything became easier to process. I started focusing on something else instead, understanding myself. I realized that what pulled me into that situation wasn't just them. It was the feeling of being noticed, of being understood, even if it wasn't real. I had been carrying that need quietly for a long time, and when it was suddenly met, even in a distorted way, I didn't question it enough. I accepted it without thinking about where it was coming from. That realization changed how I saw everything after. I became more aware of my own boundaries, not just with others, but with myself. I stopped ignoring discomfort just to avoid confrontation. I stopped staying silent when something didn't feel right. That night taught me that silence can be just as impactful as action. Sometimes more. When I see them now, it doesn't feel the same as before, but it doesn't feel overwhelming either. It's neutral. Controlled. The emotional weight that used to be there has faded, replaced by understanding rather than confusion. They're just people to me now, not something more, not something meaningful. What stayed with me wasn't them. It was the lesson. Trust isn't automatic just because someone is close to you. Familiarity doesn't guarantee safety. And not every moment that feels intense or personal is real in the way you think it is. Sometimes it's just a reflection of what you were already missing. I don't hate them. I don't blame them completely either. But I don't see them the same way, and I never will. That shift is permanent. If there's one thing that night took from me, it wasn't just comfort or innocence. It was the version of me that believed silence keeps things safe. I know now it doesn't. Silence creates space for things to go too far without being stopped. And if I could go back to that moment, to that exact point where I first felt something was off, I wouldn't wait. I wouldn't stay quiet. I wouldn't let confusion decide for me. Because some lines, once crossed, don't just disappear. They stay with you, quietly, shaping the way you see everything after.